We're going to have a discussion on the difference between programming and training. Okay.
Yes.
The reason why is because they are different. We'll kind of walk through like the evolutionary timeline of how training came first, programming came second. We're
Hmm.
going to use references that we used in the learning module on the art and science of programming. And one of
Hmm.
those is, I'll let you read the title that we use.
Programming and Organization of Training by Verkhoshansky.
Exactly. So this is by Verber and Verver essentially sports scientist. Now, this came out and you can see 1985.
Hmm.
Okay, the reason why I'm pointing out the dates on this is because the methods of strength training from the Soviet Union, which we use in the learning module, max effort
Hmm.
method, dynamic effort method, repeated efforts to failure, not to failure, those four methods came first. Okay,
Hmm.
they came in like the early 60s. I don't think I have the manual here, but if you look at like other Soviet manuals, what you'll see is those methods came first, where they
Hmm.
understood the training of it, like Medvedev, management of the weightlifter, Perlipin, etc. Right? So those methods
Hmm.
came first chronologically, and then
Hmm.
what came after that, in like the 80s, the mid 80s, because this was in the 80s, was
Hmm.
programming.
Hmm.
Okay. And let me just say something about like the structure of the Soviet Union. Because we credit them with so much stuff. And we pull
Certainly.
from so much because that's the birthplace of of exercise science, right? Zatsiorsky and the Science and Practice of Strength Training, the third edition, just proposed training science. At
Hmm.
Absolute, we're proposing programming science to
Hmm.
delineate between the two, because if you think training and programming are the same thing, you'll be in a circular loop with no reach to be able to get the people that you're working with from point A to point B.
Correct.
Okay, is there anything you want to add before I go into this?
No, I would just reiterate that, from that timeline, and you are much more knowledgeable on the timeline because you've presented that timeline multiple times, is that it is very obvious if you look back in those decades, uh, in the nation that was, creating the best athletes, that based on that timeline of, hey, we know we're working on certain training methods, 60s, 1960s, 1970s. It wasn't until the 80s that they actually figured out that there is a difference between, hey, we know how to train versus logically know how to organize the training to get what we want.
Exactly, which is programming.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to read the introduction. And let me state this, right? The Soviet Union, they were set up in a way, it was a communistic state, okay? Which means that like these resources would have been read by all the coaches. So so so
They were
this
forced to read them, is what you're saying.
yeah, yeah, we can laugh about it, but unfortunately, like, yeah, if you wanted to make it there, like the athletes were, let's say, constrained to train,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
this is kind of the top-down literature that the coaches needed to know if they wanted to get access to the best athletes, because the coaches were graded. Not only
Hmm.
were the coaches graded, but the athletes were graded. And that
Hmm.
grading system is how they were linking up the top coaches with the top athletes to then, so that then you got essentially not just the best training, but the best programming specific for that individual, specific for that sport.
Correct. Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, so let's take the time to essentially, I'm just going to read the first, and remember, like, when we were reading through this and we were essentially trying to figure out, like, how do we take what the Soviets did and build off of that, right? Like, some of this is a Russian interpretation, so it's not going to be the clearest. And then
Sure.
also, like, this is like 1985. So, like, we now know so much more now than they know,
Hmm.
right? But at the time, like when you consider the time that they're writing about this stuff, like this was mass published in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
so far ahead of the curve,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Until essentially, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm just
And then,
gonna,
and then everybody took it.
yeah. And then once the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Like think about it. This manual is reproduced over here, right? like so like as soon as and you had weightlifters, right? That's why Ververskanski was a track coach, but there's a weightlifter on here because the guy who found he just passed away. I'm gonna butcher his name because I can't enunciate, but it's like Bud Chagrin or whatever. But he was the one that went over there and was like, oh man, these guys not only know how to train, they know how to program. They have a legit strategy in place where they're just developing athletes in every sport, right? You know, another person that we use their literature in the learning module is Tom Malinsky, who did his thesis on the conjugate sequencing system, and we used that we used and referenced him in the learning module, but we also used him in that lecture when we were like, hey, this is the state of like the conjugate sequencing system. This is where it left off, and this is what we're trying to do to not replace it, to credit these individuals and to try to
Hmm.
bring it into like a new age, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah. Just sort of add on another tier.
yeah, okay, so we got programming and organization of training. Um, Louis Simmons actually gave me this book. Anyway, programming is the regulation of the contents of training in accordance with the athlete's training objectives and the specific principles determining the rational organization of training loads within a specific time frame. I'm going to read just one more sentence. Programming is a new, better form of planning training, solving tasks at a higher scientific methodological level and with a greater probability of achieving the goals.
Hmm.
Okay. So right here, this is how it starts off, right?
Nice, nice and highlighted.
Yeah, nice and highlighted, right? Like these are all notes that we obviously used in the art and science of programming. Okay, so what we see here is a delineation between training and programming. Now, obviously, we know that there's a difference between training and programming, which is why we have the art and science of programming,
Hmm.
right? Okay. Do you want me to pass it off to you so that you can kind of go through that difference to a degree, or do you want me to keep going?
Why don't you keep going, and then we can have a discussion about how we view all of it together.
Okay, perfect. So when you read this, right, like this is from the 80s. So, like I try to read things in the context, right? Like I remember vividly reading from Zatsiorsky when he's discussing the hidden potential of a muscle to produce more force, which
Hmm.
then,
Hmm.
and it was cool because I read that. And then,
Hmm.
like, when the science and practice of strength training came out, I read that, oh, now they've changed that. It's evolved to the MSD, the muscular strength deficit,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? But it was a really potent time for me personally because at the time I was competing in bodybuilding. I was
Sure.
working at Westside Barbell with Louis Simmons. He's exposing me to all of this Russian literature. I can see it in real time. I'm treating all the athletes, I'm assessing all the athletes that are there, right? And at that point in time, I remember thinking, man, training is this potent stimulus that is essentially like it's just work, but it's work that finds this hidden potential,
Hmm.
right? We change that hidden potential to limiting constraints
Sure.
because now we actually like we have a target. We have a very specific target. The Soviets' target was external at what we term now the level of competition. So if you're on a weightlifting platform, if you're on the track and field, that's the level of competition.
Sure.
That is an external level. So all the stuff that they were doing, you can see the gap in what they were doing because they were looking at everything externally. Why? Because the programming and training intent linked up to try to win Olympic sports. Okay.
Sure. Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. So we obviously saw the gap because, we're both clinicians, but we're also strength coaches. So we're functioning, I always joke, we're functioning in conjugation, right?
Hmm.
Doing both, like meaning concurrently, right? And we write extensively and credit Louis Simmons extensively because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have like I wouldn't have this. He gave this to me. I would not have this, right?
Sure.
So long story short, what's interesting is you can see how the evolution of how the Soviets were thinking, and then it was like everything external. And then Ververskanski's last works, when he's talking about the fundamentals of special strength, he's talking about special strength, and it's like these vague definitions of what
Hmm.
it is because they didn't know enough about the inside. which is
Certainly.
the reason why, if you think about it, right? Like this is one of the ways that I simply think about it is like when you're training for elements or sub elements of point B, right? Right? Like so and if you think about it this way, let me explain it this way,
Hmm.
right? Like you can train connective tissue, but you need to program for reactive strength. The two
Hmm.
the two are different, right?
Hmm.
Because of the new definition that we have of reactive strength and the special strengths of point B, right? And so
Hmm.
immediately you're thinking, okay, well, like I need to program training to get to reactive strength, which means that now you're programming for a very specific thing. And think about it this way. How do you program for something if you can't define it?
Hmm. Hmm.
You can't. You're just training, right? And that's the gap that, we saw, which is the reason why, like I said, like that's why we came up with the art and science of programming. And, when organizations reach out to us and we start to assess, like, what is it that you guys want from us? We figure out that a lot of people know how to train, but the blind spot is programming.
So let me maybe just paraphrase or summarize what you just said because I think it's important and maybe and I don't want it to get missed. So and you can correct me because it's your words and I'm trying to paraphrase your words. Just so you can correct me if I don't say it according to how you meant it. What you're saying is at the point B level, we have defined what are the four fundamental capacities of high performance. Okay. We have defined those as to what they are, what they entail. We've defined them all as special strengths. So ultimately, by having that definition of what those special strengths are, it gives the programmer an idea of how to potentially cultivate those special strengths. If you take any one of those special strengths, which we have done as information within the learning module as well, but we've also written articles over the last 3 years detailing all of this on our Substack. That each one of those ultimate special strengths is cultivated by training specific elements and behaviors of elements along the way to get there.
Correct.
So far, I'm correct. Okay.
Yes.
What you are saying is that in addition to being able to define all of those special strengths, we also have to understand that those are the only four special strengths that exist in high performance. So they are all going to interrelate to each other.
Hmm.
Okay. So going back to what I was saying, that means that absolute strength. Like let's talk about reactive strength as you brought it up. In our model of reactive strength, there's a top-down, bottom-up component. The top-down component actually comes from a different special strength, correct? And so
Exactly.
if you don't have that definition of uh, each one of those special strengths, but you understand the training principles or the training of elements under each one, and you just do that, you're not ultimately going to achieve the output of reactive strength.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so in summary, there, training is the knowledge of kind of the fact that reactive strength, for example, exists on in connective tissue primarily from an element perspective, but if you trained connective tissue because you know how to train it, but you don't know how to program for reactive strength, ultimately you wouldn't create the special strength behavior of reactive strength. All you would do is you would be training in a, progressive way connective tissue. But until you truly understand the idea of point B as being special strengths that are interrelated, you have to understand how each one has principles of training to it, but also if you actually want to cultivate that behavior, how they all interrelate.
Exactly.
And so what you're
100%.
saying is that that is ultimately one of the major differences between training and programming. Because listen, a lot of people know how to train, and even from the usage of people that follow absolute and the usage of point B, like I think you could ask anybody that has followed along for the last few years with us, they would know how to train the things that get them those special strengths. Where we want to take it and where we're taking it and continuing to add on, which we started with the learning module and are going to continue to move forward. And what we want people to understand is that that's like understanding the systems of training, but it's not understanding how you kind of synergize them all into a strategy, because we've talked about a strategy before, and you mentioned a strategy of training that allows you to acquire one or more of those things simultaneously.
Exactly. Yes, this is exactly. And how do we this is one of the things, because we're trying to be as useful as we can to people to enable them to take their training and put it through the lens of programming to enable them to get much better outcomes. Okay, which like that's what the Soviets were onto. But it's interesting, because we've read so much about the Soviets and working extensively with Louis Simmons for over a decade, and understanding like how he saw it. We go through things like, he was essentially running his own system of training, right? That the Science and Practice of Strength Training, the first edition, didn't come out, and he had already set like multiple all-time world records because he had figured out how to do his own programming, and he programmed that system, like the West Side Conjugate system, for the sport of powerlifting. And so what I would see all the time is like, hey, you got an NFL lineman, they're doing the West Side system, but like the West Side system is for powerlifting. It's not for an NFL
Mm-hmm,
lineman, right? It's a
mm-hmm,
programming problem, right? So all
mm-hmm.
so like, I would always see where like there would be this disconnect where it's like Louis knew how to organize all the training to get the lift to point B, which is the same thing the Soviets did, right? Now the Soviets, and if you follow that timeline, that's the logical progression, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
essentially the people that we are trying to give them this information and enable them to kind of come up with their own strategies to use systems to then have like this overarching strategy is to take an athlete from point A to point B. But if you think about it this way, like, I remember when I was learning how to train and I was there, and it's like, I went to school for exercise science. And then, I'm working with Louis Simmons, and I'm like, he's doing things that I never learned about, and vice versa, right? You can see that the chronological order for people is you're going to first learn how to treat and train, and then after you know how to kind of do that, then the next step is how do you become the strategist? How do you
Sure.
organize this stuff and sequence this stuff in a manner where you're not just getting like one thing or two things, you're getting a multitude of things, right? Like we've written so extensively about this, right? And the only way that you can do that is if you understand the difference between training and programming. Because if you don't understand that difference, you will always be within a system and you'll never be able to generate a strategy, which is the reason why we have a lecture that shows how it started off as a method into a system. And now, guess what? Now, with what we've done with the inside out model of special strengths, you can now have a strategy. And
Mhm.
furthermore, that strategy now opens up to the clinical space
I was just going
because,
to say that, you know, I don't mean to interrupt, but there's a whole nother, there's a whole other world there on the clinical side that this has real value for. And, you know, from my own experience as being primarily a clinician, is, you know, we are, I think clinicians are very, very proficient at understanding maybe uh, how to do things, you know, whether that be, you know, manual inputs, whether that be exercise inputs, whatever it is, but they don't necessarily, maybe the less experienced ones, or maybe the less, you know, what am I trying to say? Not less experienced, or the ones that maybe haven't put it all together yet,
mhm.
uh, don't necessarily know how to structure those things in a way that allows for an end goal. And so let me give you a like a really simple example, because it's quite common. Shoulder Client with shoulder pain or discomfort presents with shoulder pain or discomfort, which, you know, ultimately ends up being a rotator cuff injury. And so most of the time on the clinical side of things, you know, the plan, which isn't actually a plan, it's just a bucket full of things to be done, is, okay, well, I'm going to do some soft tissue work, I'm going to do some mobilization work, and then I will give some exercises. And so ultimately what ends up happening is you have sessions, clinical sessions of, okay, well, I did soft tissue work to this, and then I mobilized the humerus in this way, and then I gave banded rotational work. And so the issue is now we have all these potentially great things, but we haven't organized them in a way that allows one to build on another and one to build on another. And I remember back in my educational days, you know, we had a rehab class, and the rehab class was, you know, it was good in its day, I guess. It was very evidence based, where we would, you know, be presented with, you know, well, here is the evidence on rehabilitation of the shoulder rotator cuff injury. These are the exercises that have been shown to be effective in these studies. So what ended up happening is our rehabilitation class would be, well, these are the 5 things you should do when clients come in with rotator cuff problem. You should do them for 3 sets by 10 repetitions. Off you go. And so I think that this has large carryover effects, because I feel like there's a lot of clinicians who have a lot of great tools and a lot of understanding of injury and injury mechanisms, and how to ultimately rehabilitate those and train to get those things back to where they need to be. But oftentimes they don't start with a very clear definition of what the issue is. So what we can say is, we can say that a rotator cuff injury now in this client might be related to a dysfunctional shoulder joint, and it might be related to a weakened or structurally compromised tendon, or 1 or 2 tendons, which is reactive strength. And we might
Mhm.
also say that, generally looking at this client and their health history and their training history, that this client is maybe lacks some strength in their upper limb, which technically then relates to the neural network, which then relates to some absolute strength. So now you have a definition, and you can say, well, these are the things that would help. These would be the training inputs that would help for the strength issue. These are the training inputs that would ultimately help and would progress the tendon issue. And these are the inputs that would ultimately allow me to improve the function of the glenohumeral joint. Okay, where is this client right now in all three of these things? And how do I link all of these things together so that as I create the inputs to improve the shoulder, where can I be on the reactive strength training continuum? And where can I be in training of the neural network, right? Rather than just, well, I'm going to do some tissue work and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. Now you're able to say, well, I'm going to probably have this client for the next 4 to 6 weeks. At the end of that 6 weeks, I would like to see 50% improvement in strength. I would like to see 30% improvement in joint function as defined by capsular space. I would like to see the ability to undergo moderate speed eccentric loading. And now you can sort of fill in what is the strategy of how you're going to get there.
Yeah, that's potent. I feel like that's what we need to end on because you've said that I've defined what the problem is, right? And the problem and how we do that in the learning modules, we define them as limiting constraints. So you've identified limiting constraints. You know the training or the treatment, and technically we're using both in conjugation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now you have a way to actually program to move that person from point A to point B. And based off of the individuality of that person's problem, their strategy is going to look different than somebody else that maybe has the same quote unquote things on a piece of paper. Like you can't, like that's why you can't use a system. You have to have a strategy because the strategy is how you're going to move them from this initial point where you're assessing and you're trying to, and on the assessment, what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is I'm trying to figure out what elements of point B I need to program for. Once you identify the elements, how you sequence the elements in time and over time is the strategy for that person.
Correct. And so I just want to add one more thing because um, getting back to the original definition that you read on programming is that the time frame is really important. And so when you are not considering programming and you were only considering training, oftentimes training doesn't come with a time frame. Training
Hmm.
is what am I going to train today? What are the inputs that I can do today? The time is very important because that's ultimately how you constrain the training. And learning how to constrain the training is technically a component of what programming is. And so learning how to constrain time is ultimately based on feedback. So getting back to the example that I was using, and I'm using a clinical example, but for those of you who are not clinicians, just think about this as a strength-based scenario as well. If you know that it's going to take roughly 6 weeks to see a certain percentage of improvement, um, you have to break that 6 weeks down into more intermediate time frames, right? And then you have
Hmm.
to break those intermediate time frames down into daily time frames.
Hmm.
Because ultimately, when you think about it as 6 weeks, that's too long to be able to say, well, I'm going to do this on week 1 and this on week 2. Because when you're thinking about strategizing for multiple things, and you're working through these multiple things, you might see you might see jumps that you didn't expect, and you have to be prepared for those. And so being prepared for those means that you ultimately have to replan for potentially what the next session might look like or what the next week might look like. Because, ultimately when you learn programming and not just putting in inputs, you will see changes that are sometimes unexpected, and you have to be prepared for those changes. And so that is the importance of feedback, because feedback allows you to constrain time.
Yeah, that's perfect because what you're saying is all the elements of point B are entangled, which is true because if you think about high performance, it's a compression and a conjugation. So all those elements occur concurrently or in compression to then output. And
Hmm.
so what you're saying is they're all entangled. And that's the reason why you have to have a not like those have to be defined in a way where they're programmable.
Yes. Yes.